The boarding agent didn't even look twice. "Your ticket's invalid. You can't board this flight." Her voice was sharp, final, like a door slamming shut. Kian Forrester, standing calmly in his tailored suit, held out his phone again. His first-class boarding pass, perfectly valid, glowed on the screen. "Please check again. It's correct." But she wasn't checking. She was already waving him aside, eyes scanning the next passenger as if he no longer existed. People around them turned to watch, some curious, some amused, some uneasy, but no one stepped in. Kian had seen this before. The sudden denial, the public dismissal, the silent calculation. "You don't belong here." His voice stayed even. "Would you like to see my ID? My paper ticket?" The agent crossed her arms. "Sir, step aside. We're done here." A familiar ache tightened in his chest. It wasn't anger. It was exhaustion. What she didn't know, what no one at that gate knew, was that Kian was about to make a single phone call that would turn the entire situation upside down. A call that would cost her everything. Hours earlier, the airport had been still. The hush of early morning rested over the international terminal, broken only by the distant rumble of jet engines and the quiet shuffle of footsteps on polished floors. The space carried a stillness that made each sound sharp. The roll of suitcase wheels, the faint click of departure board shifting, the low murmur of announcements barely cutting through the calm. Kian Forrester moved to the terminal with measured steps, his presence steady, his rhythm unhurried, his suit a deep charcoal, fit with effortless precision, not a statement but a reflection of years spent navigating spaces where appearances carried weight. In one hand, he carried a leather briefcase, well-worn but carefully kept, a quiet symbol of his position as CEO of Iridian Innovations, a leader in ethical AI with contracts rooted in aviation and beyond. His path through the terminal was familiar, but his gaze remained sharp, not because the route was new, but because experience had taught him that familiarity never guaranteed safety. He observed the hurried traveler brushing past him, the family huddled near the seating area, the airline staff scanning the crowd. His expression stayed composed, yet beneath that surface lived a steady alertness, a readiness built from years of watching for the small, subtle moments when doors that should open stayed firmly shut. This readiness was not paranoia. It was practice. It was survival. The weight he carried wasn't visible in his posture, but it pressed against him all the same. Kian understood the quiet cost of constantly walking into rooms where his presence stirred questions before his name was ever spoken. He was used to the silent checks, the double glances, the hesitation when presenting credentials that should have been enough. He had built success within a system that often demanded he prove himself more than once, even when others moved forward without question. Kian's thoughts flickered briefly to the countless spaces where he had been made to feel he did not fully belong. Restaurants that offered him the least visible table, boardrooms where his ideas gained weight only when repeated by someone else, flights where he was always flagged for additional screening. These were not distant memories. They had formed a pattern, one he had learned to navigate without fanfare. There was no visible sign of resistance in him this morning. His movements were smooth, his breathing even, but the awareness remained, a constant calculation of the risks that followed him through airports, offices, and every doorway where success should have been a passport but wasn't always accepted. The checkpoint passed without issue, but Kian's guard did not lower. He had walked this path many times, and still, the expectation lingered that access could be questioned at any point. As he neared Gate 14, where the first-class passengers would soon board a flight to Geneva, his gaze shifted toward the airline agent stationed at the podium. She appeared to be reviewing boarding passes with smooth efficiency. His phone stayed ready in his hand. The line to board was beginning to form. His breathing remained steady. His pace did not change. But within him, the quiet readiness sharpened. The moment was about to unfold. Earlier that morning, the airport had stirred quietly. The low hum of machinery pressed gently against the silence, broken only by the soft roll of suitcase wheels and the faint shuffle of early travelers adjusting their bags. A quiet rhythm moved through the terminal, steady but unhurried. Kian walked with measured steps, his presence composed, his movements unforced. His suit, cut to fit without excess, carried no loud signals. It simply fit the man who wore it. In one hand, He held a leather briefcase, wore at the edges but carefully maintained. It wasn't a symbol. It was simply his. He had traveled through airports like this many times. The signs, the process, the order of things were all familiar. But experience had taught him that familiarity did not mean freedom. His gaze moved across the terminal. The woman gathering her coat, the father scanning his boarding pass, the security officers watching the flow. Kian noticed everything, not out of habit, but out of necessity. There was a constant readiness beneath his calm, a careful awareness of the small, quiet moments when something could shift without warning. Years of entering spaces where his presence was quietly questioned had shaped his habit. He had built success, earned titles, and secured partnerships that placed him among the most respected in his field. Yet, there was always a shadow that followed, a silent question about whether he truly belonged. This was not paranoia. This was preparation. Kian moved through the security checkpoint smoothly. The agent there scanned his pass, confirmed his documents, and waved him through with a nod. No delays, no questions. But Kian did not relax. He had learned that the barriers could appear later. They often did. His thoughts drifted briefly to past moments that had pressed against him. The lunch reservation where he had been seated near the service door. The meeting where his idea was overlooked until restated by someone else. The repeated selections for additional screening at airports across the country. None of these memories lived far from the surface. Kian's pace remained steady, his breathing even, but the quiet readiness inside him sharpened as he approached his gate. Gate 14. Flight to Geneva. His boarding pass was already open on his phone. The first-class lane was beginning to form a short, efficient line. The usual sounds filled the space. Announcements echoing, agents calling boarding groups, soft conversations blending into the steady movement of the terminal. He kept his posture relaxed. His steps were sure, unhurried, but the watchfulness never softened. Success had taught him many things. One lesson stayed constant. Entry could always be questioned. The agent at the podium was processing passengers with quick, practiced motions. Her hands moved swiftly from scanner to boarding pass, her voice crisp as she called the next name. Kian stepped forward, presenting his pass. His breathing stayed calm. His face remained composed. But inside, his readiness locked into place. The moment had arrived. The agent's glance, brief but loaded, set the tone. Her eyes traveled from Kian's boarding pass to his face, then over his carefully tailored suit. She paused, almost as if she needed a moment to process what she was seeing. Her lips tightened slightly, an expression too controlled to be casual. "Is this your ticket, sir?" Her voice was smooth, but held something sharper beneath the surface. Not curiosity, something else. The question wasn't genuine. It didn't ask for clarification. It quietly challenged whether he belonged at that gate. Kian's response was simple, direct. "Yes, it is. Please, scan it." Instead, she gestured. "I'll need to see your physical ID." He handed it over without hesitation. She scrutinized the card longer than necessary, her brow creasing as if waiting to find something that wasn't there. "Your paper ticket. Please." Kian's tone didn't change. "The digital pass is valid. It's already linked." Her gaze lifted, steady now, pressing against him. "Paper ticket, sir." The request didn't make sense. First-class boarding on international flights had long accepted digital passes. Still, Kian produced the paper version from his briefcase, handing it to her with calm precision. She inspected it as if it might reveal some hidden flaw, flipping it once, then again, before finally offering her verdict. "There seems to be an issue. This ticket might be misissued, or duplicated." Her words weren't uncertain. They were deliberate. Kian's pulse stayed steady, but the weight behind his ribs settled deeper. "There's no issue. The ticket is valid. Please verify." But she was already gesturing toward the side. "You'll need to resolve this at the service desk. You can't board at this time." Passengers nearby watched the exchange in silence. Some looked down quickly when Kian's eyes met theirs. Others simply stared. The quiet rejection, public and firm, replayed a rhythm Kian knew well. This wasn't the first time. It wasn't a surprise. But familiarity didn't make it easier. His grandmother's story surfaced in his mind. Eunice had traveled by bus, by train, across towns where waiting rooms were labeled in plain terms. She used to tell him about the wooden benches worn smooth from hours of waiting in the sections they were told to use. She spoke of airports where restrooms were labeled for some, but not for all, where separate didn't just mean distant. It meant smaller, less clean, less welcome. Eunice never raised her voice in those stories. She just described the waiting, the glances, the quiet barriers that stretched across decades. Kian's breath came slow and steady. His face remained composed. Ilara's next words struck sharper. "Sir, step aside. We need to continue boarding." It was not a suggestion. It was a dismissal. Her focus shifted to the next traveler, her body already turning away from him. This was no accident, no misunderstanding. It was a familiar pattern wrapped in new forms. Years ago, it had been restaurants seating him near the exit, car dealerships where he was passed over for other customers, business meetings where proposals landed flat until someone else echoed them. He remembered walking through security checks where he was always chosen for additional screening. The process explained as random, but his name always seemed to be on that invisible list. These memories didn't live in the past. They rode with him, pressed into the fabric of his everyday movements. Ilara's request wasn't about policy. It was about doubt dressed as procedure. His success didn't shield him from it. His company's contracts didn't exempt him. The questions always found him. But Kian didn't argue. He didn't plead. His phone rested lightly in his palm, his thumb already unlocking it. His stillness wasn't passivity. It was a measured patience. Ilara, perhaps mistaking his calm for submission, stepped further into performance. "I need security to assist. Passenger is non-compliant. At gate 14, her voice carried now, meant to be heard. Not loud, but loud enough. She looked past him as if he had already been removed, as if her words alone would erase his place in the line. Other passengers shuffled, some stepping back, others pretending not to notice. Some held their phones, unsure whether to record or to look away. Kian's call connected quickly. His words were quiet, but his tone carried weight. "This is Kian Forrester. I'm at gate 14. There's a boarding issue. My first-class ticket has been flagged as misissued. I'm being denied boarding without cause. The agent is escalating." He paused, listening. His posture didn't change. Ilara's supervisor approached, brisk but composed. "What seems to be the issue?" he asked, directing his question toward Ilara. "Passenger presented a ticket that appears invalid. He's refusing to comply." The supervisor turned toward Kian. "Your name, sir?" "Kian Forrester, CEO of Iridian Innovations. I've just spoken with your corporate office." The name landed first. The weight of it arrived next. The supervisor's stance shifted, his focus sharpening. His eyes flicked to Ilara, then back to Kian. There was no policy issue. There never had been. Kian remained still. The supervisor's phone buzzed at his hip. He answered. His face changed as he listened. He didn't speak over the call. He simply nodded, listening carefully. When the call ended, his next words left no space for delay. "Ilara, you're relieved of duty. Please surrender your badge." Ilara's mouth opened, disbelief visible in the sharpness of her breath. "But now." Her hands trembled as she unclipped her badge and handed it over. Security staff, previously distant, stepped forward with quiet urgency. Kian's breathing never broke rhythm. His shoulders stayed relaxed. His gaze stayed steady. There was no satisfaction in his expression, no need for celebration. There was only quiet resolve. The crowd watched, their silence settling over the gate area. Some shifted uncomfortably. Others watched with new understanding. The moment had passed, but its weight remained. Kian's ticket was never in question. His identity was never the issue. But the lesson now hung in the air, undeniable. Without raising his voice, without moving from his place, Kian had made a call that brought accountability into the open. He walked forward, his boarding pass still glowing on his phone, his pace steady, his posture unchanged. But the weight in his chest lightened, if only slightly. Ilara's voice rose, This time louder, a deliberate attempt to control the narrative. I have a disruptive passenger at gate 14 attempting to board with a fraudulent ticket. The words didn't just describe a problem. They carried accusation, designed to sway the crowd, to frame Kian as the source of trouble. Passengers paused, their attention captured. Some looked toward Kian, others whispered quietly. A few pulled out their phones, unsure whether to document or to mind their own business. Ilara's tone hardened, gaining momentum from the crowd's quiet. "Sir, you need to comply. Security has been notified." Kian remained still, his phone resting against his ear. His words remained calm, almost measured. "Yes, this is Kian Forrester. I'm being denied boarding despite holding a valid first-class ticket. The agent, Ilara Vance, is escalating the situation publicly. I'm requesting immediate intervention." His voice did not rise to match hers. He did not match her tempo. He didn't need to. While she raised her volume, he raised his reach. Kian wasn't calling a customer service line. He wasn't requesting assistance from an airport desk. His call reached higher, much higher. Ilara pressed her earpiece firmly, glancing quickly toward the security checkpoint as if waiting for backup. She misread his calm. She thought she was winning. Her words continued, her voice intended for everyone nearby. Passengers refusing to step aside, attempting to bypass standard boarding protocols. There was no bypass. There was no disruption. But by the time she finished speaking, the story had already been planted in the minds of those watching. Kian's reply remained soft but firm. "Yes, I understand. I'll hold." He lowered his hand slightly, the phone still active. His eyes met Ilara's, not with challenge, but with certainty. Her gaze sharpened. "Sir, you need to leave this area now." A uniformed supervisor approached from the corridor, Mr. Thorne. His stride was purposeful, his jaw set, his attention aimed squarely at Ilara. He wasn't rushing, but there was an edge to his pace that cut through the tension gathering at the gate. Ilara turned toward him quickly, eager to control the story before he arrived. The passenger presented an invalid ticket and is refusing to comply. I requested security support. He's creating a disturbance. Thorne didn't respond immediately. His eyes moved to Kian, registering the details in front of him. His focus shifted briefly to the phone in Kian's hand, still connected. Kian offered his introduction without waiting. "Kian Forrester, CEO of Iridian Innovations. I've spoken directly with your corporate office. They're aware." The weight of the name caught Thorne's attention fully now. Recognition flickered across his face, followed quickly by something else, a quiet realization that the ground had shifted. Thorne's phone buzzed, a quiet alert at his hip. He answered immediately, turning slightly away from Ilara. His conversation was brief. He listened, his posture tightening as the message reached him. His free hand closed around the edge of his clipboard, his grip firm. When he ended the call, he faced Ilara directly. "Ilara, you are relieved of duty. Surrender your badge immediately." The words cut through the waiting crowd. Ilara blinked, her voice faltering. "Sir, I was just following. Your badge." Now, Thorne's voice held no room for argument. Passengers near the gate stopped moving. The sound of boarding announcements blurred in the background as the air around them held still. Ilara's hands trembled as she unclipped her badge and handed it over. Her mouth opened, searching for the right defense, but none came. "This is a direct order. Your employment with Stellar Ground Services has been terminated, effective immediately. Thorne's words landed with finality. Ilara's face lost color. Her breathing quickened, but the decision was sealed. Security officers who had quietly approached now stood nearby, ready to escort her away. Her eyes darted from Kian to Thorne, her voice thin. "I didn't mean—" Thorne's reply was measured. "Your actions are not aligned with the standards required at this airport. You may collect your personal items. Ilara's steps, once firm and confident, now faltered as she walked toward the exit. The people watching didn't cheer, didn't speak. They simply followed her departure with their eyes. The quiet around gate 14 deepened. Kian's breathing never changed. His phone remained in his hand, the call now completed. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't moved from his place. Yet the result was unmistakable. Thorne turned toward him, his tone shifting now. "Mr. Forrester, please allow me to personally escort you onto your flight." Kian gave a small nod, his expression composed. As he walked toward the boarding lane, the atmosphere around him had shifted. The glances were no longer dismissive. They carried something else now, a growing recognition, a silent understanding of what they had just witnessed. Some passengers lowered their eyes. Others tracked the steps quietly, processing what had unfolded. Ilara's story, quickly framed, loudly declared, had crumbled in front of them. Her confidence, built on an assumption that she controlled the space, had vanished in seconds. Kian boarded the plane without haste, placing his briefcase carefully in the overhead compartment. His seat by the window faced the morning light. As he settled in, his breathing stayed steady, his heartbeat calm. The lesson didn't need to be repeated. The gate area would not forget. Thorne returned to the terminal, his phone pressed to his ear, his words quiet but urgent as he no doubt reported the completed dismissal. Passengers resumed boarding, but the rhythm had changed. There was a new sharpness in the staff's movements, a visible recalibration in how they approached their roles. Kian's influence had reached far beyond a personal victory. It had altered the tone of the terminal. The quiet power of his response had left a mark. He didn't need to announce it. He didn't need to demand it. His calm insistence, his silent call, and his refusal to accept the imposed story had rewritten the outcome. The same passengers who had initially glanced past him now carried a memory of what they had seen. They had watched an assumption collapse in real time. Kian's journey to Geneva would continue as scheduled, but the gate, the staff, and those who witnessed the shift would carry this memory long after the flight had departed, without raised voices, without force. Just one call, just one moment, and everything had changed. Kian did not speak to the press. There were no social media posts, no calls for headlines. He boarded his flight, completed his journey, and returned to his work as if the morning's events had been nothing more than a routine inconvenience. But the story did not remain quiet. Inside the airline's corporate structure, it moved quickly. The call he had placed triggered more than an individual correction. It set off a process that traveled through executive offices, compliance teams, and internal ethics committees. Ilara's dismissal was immediate, but it was not the end. Within days, reports of the incident circulated through the airline's leadership channels. The details were reviewed carefully. This was not presented as a simple customer service failure. It was classified as a critical breakdown in employee conduct with potential legal exposure. The airline's partnership with Veridian Innovations amplified the weight of the situation. Kian's company had influence that extended beyond software. Veridian's technology was embedded in the airline's safety and logistics systems, forming a long-term relationship that neither party could afford to compromise. The ground handling company, Stellar Ground Services, received urgent communication from the airline's legal division. The message was clear. Employee conduct had triggered an executive-level complaint tied directly to one of their largest infrastructure partners. The pressure mounted swiftly. The airline insisted on corrective action beyond a single termination. A formal investigation began, not just to review Ilara's behavior, but to assess supervisory practices, staff training, and the decision-making processes that had allowed bias to pass unchecked at the boarding gate. It wasn't about punishing one person. It was about reducing the risk of recurrence. Stellar Ground Services, facing contract review, moved fast. A company-wide memo ordered immediate training updates for all frontline employees. Supervisors were instructed to attend new leadership sessions focused on managing escalations without bias. The changes were not designed for public display. There were no press releases, no stage commitments. These adjustments happened within the walls of the organizations involved, quiet but lasting. Flight crews, customer service agents, and gate teams began hearing about the Gate 14 incident in private briefings. It became an example not of external scandal, but of internal accountability. Leaders reminded staff that misjudgments could reach the highest levels in seconds, and that proximity to power was no longer measured by appearance. Employees who might have dismissed previous diversity trainings now approached the sessions with fresh attention. Supervisors who once overlooked subtle bias in their teams began correcting small infractions quickly, Recognizing the deeper cost of ignoring them, the airline's leadership team expanded its review, questioning not only how Alara had handled the situation, but whether her colleagues had been prepared to intervene. In the past, such incidents might have faded into paperwork and quiet departures. This time, the story carried further. It spread among employees in other cities, Chicago, Atlanta, and New York, passing from shift leads to gate agents, from scheduling managers to security staff. Kian's name was rarely spoken aloud, but the story carried weight. The lesson was simple. Bias, even when wrapped in company procedure, could cost more than just a job. It could damage relationships that held long-term value for the airline's future. There was no need for Kian to appear in interviews. His silence underscored the depth of his influence. Much like Dorian's quiet legacy years before, Kian's approach set a precedent that did not require his continued presence. He had not filed a complaint for publicity. He had not sought apologies in the press. His action was swift, direct, and quietly effective. The ripple continued through Stellar's hiring practices. Background checks remained, but now the interview process included scenario-based assessments on bias recognition. New staff orientation began featuring case studies drawn from real incidents. The training didn't carry a banner, but the message settled into the day-to-day expectations of staff at every level. Gate agents, once accustomed to making snap decisions without pause, now checked themselves. Supervisors, who might have overlooked those moments, began asking different questions. The corporate memory of what had happened at Gate 14 became part of the system. Kian, meanwhile, continued his work at Viridian Innovations. His focus remained on his company's development projects and community initiatives. He declined quiet offers for formal apologies beyond those already received. The weight of what had happened did not rest on public platforms. It remained embedded in the operational adjustments, in the changed behaviors of staff, in the revised manuals and updated protocols. Months later, at a separate airport, a gate agent paused while reviewing a first-class passenger's boarding pass. She hesitated briefly, recalling a story shared in training about an incident that had unfolded not long before. She double-checked the ticket, offered a respectful nod, and waved the passenger through without hesitation. Her supervisor watched the exchange and moved on without concern. This was not a grand moment. There were no witnesses who would recount it later, but the pause had meant something. The hesitation to repeat past mistakes had taken root. The industry had not transformed overnight, but something had shifted. Kian's leadership style had reinforced a message that change did not always roar. It often arrived quietly, with lasting effect. His story became a quiet current within the airline's internal operations, a reminder that assumptions carry consequences, that dignity is not negotiable, and that silent influence can push systems toward better choices. His refusal to seek attention allowed the focus to stay where it mattered, on the realignment of the institution, on the quiet recalibration of everyday decisions. The ripple spread, small, steady, undeniable. The story of Gate 14 never made headlines. It moved in quiet exchanges, whispered during staff meetings, passed from shift leads to new hires. It became a reference not written in manuals, but known among those who worked the gates. Kian never needed to return to that terminal for his influence to linger. The memory of what unfolded that morning had settled into the rhythm of the place. Months later, Kian traveled through a different airport. His steps were steady, his focus unchanged. He still carried the readiness that experience had taught him. But there was something else now, a subtle shift in how those around him moved. The agent who reviewed his documents paused, not in suspicion, but in careful consideration. The boarding pass was scanned with the attention it deserved. The process was smooth, but the weight behind it had changed. The agent took no shortcuts. She offered a respectful nod, confirming what should have been obvious. That pause, that slight recalibration, was not coincidence. It had been shaped by stories like his. Gate agents, once quick to make assumptions based on appearance, now paused longer, reviewed tickets more carefully, and stepped into their roles with an added layer of attention. They remembered the cost of getting it wrong. Supervisors who might have previously supported their agents without question now carried a different posture. They stayed present, watched interactions more closely, and made space for accountability. The quiet story of Gate 14 had become part of their training, not as a formal module, but as something shared between colleagues. It wasn't the only story shaping change. Dorian's experience years earlier had followed a similar path. He, too, had chosen not to amplify the incident publicly. Yet, within Horizon Air, his story carried weight. Agents who had once dismissed concerns began choosing their words more carefully. Supervisors became more visible. The memory of Dorian's calm, decisive action spread across terminals, affecting agents who never met him. At JFK, a similar shift had taken root after another quiet correction. Agents adjusted their pace. Security teams hovered less, and decision-making slowed enough to catch the bias before it hardened into denial. These stories didn't need to be broadcast to reshape behaviors. They moved through internal channels, embedded themselves in day-to-day operations, and became silent warnings that proximity to power wasn't always visible. For Kian, these shifts mattered more than public apologies or formal recognition. The weight of these small changes carried further than any statement could. The staff at the gate now paused before challenging a ticket. They reconsidered before asking unnecessary questions. They remembered that the quiet passenger in the premium lane might be the person who could reach their leadership in a single call. The lesson wasn't about fear. It was about fairness. The adjustment wasn't universal. Bias didn't vanish overnight. Kian knew that, but in the spaces he moved through, the difference was noticeable. There were fewer assumptions, fewer glances loaded with doubt, more measured responses. These changes didn't erase the long history that had built his vigilance, but they lightened its weight, even if just slightly. In conversations among airport staff, the story of Gate 14 circulated. It wasn't always told with full accuracy. Sometimes the details shifted, the names blurred, but the core remained. It became a quiet standard, a moment reference to caution others about the lasting reach of their choices. It reminded them that disrespect could ripple far beyond a single interaction. When Kian returned to familiar airports, the agent's greetings felt less practiced and more intentional. They looked him in the eye. They handled his documents with care, not scrutiny. The process, though quick, now carried a different energy. Kian never asked for this adjustment. He never expected it. Yet it arrived, shaped by the memory his quiet response had left behind. In meetings across Viridian Innovations, Kian continued his work without speaking about that morning. His influence extended into policy design, training collaborations, and technology that would help flag patterns of bias. He focused on creating structures that supported equity, not moments that demanded attention. His leadership remained steady, unannounced. The shift in airport culture did not emerge from a loud movement. It built from steady reminders, private conversations, and a growing understanding among staff that assumptions held consequences. Kian's story became part of a connected thread, stretching from Dorian's legacy to the recalibration at JFK, and now to the gates where staff moved with greater care. These shifts, though not sweeping, settled into the daily rhythm. Agents now paused. Supervisors now questioned. Small adjustments took hold. Gate 14 became more than a location. It became a memory stitched into the way staff handled boarding, especially when they encountered passengers who didn't match their assumptions. The whispered story was simple. You never know who is standing at the gate. It wasn't told to elevate fear. It was told to elevate respect. Kian's story never asked for attention. It asked for fairness. That, in the end, is what remained. Kian's experience was not an isolated moment. It was part of a long, unbroken line of barriers that Black travelers have faced, barriers that changed form over the years but never fully disappeared. Airports today appear open, their architecture suggesting progress, their policies promising equal treatment. But for Black travelers, the experience is often included invisible hurdles that carry a heavy cost. The phrase "flying while Black" exists for a reason. It was built from generations of exclusion, restriction, and quiet resistance. Kian's grandmother, Eunice, traveled by bus long before air travel became accessible to most. She told him about waiting rooms labeled clearly, sectioning people based on skin color. She spoke of entrances reserved for some and blocked for others, of airports where restrooms and seating areas were divided. These places were not distant from today. They stood in cities that still operate major airports now. The waiting rooms changed. The signs came down. but the habits lingered. For Black travelers, the journey has never been about reaching the destination alone. It has also been about surviving the process of moving through spaces that challenge their right to be there. Modern travel introduced new layers. Security procedures promised neutrality, but often delivered something else. Black women have been singled out for invasive pat-downs, their natural hair repeatedly flagged as requiring additional screening. Agents, claiming standard checks, have placed hands where no justification could truly reach. Kian's own path through security lines was familiar. The phrase random selection followed him from city to city, year after year. It was a familiar script: extra checks, additional questions, the quiet pressure to accept it without objection. These weren't one-time events. They built up over a lifetime. The emotional weight of moving through public spaces while constantly being reevaluated takes a toll that cannot be measured by policies alone. The cost is not just in time or inconvenience. It's in the steady erosion of dignity. Every hesitation at a checkpoint, every glance that lingers too long, every request that carries more suspicion than necessity, it compounds. Kian's boarding denial at Gate 14 was another entry in this enduring record. It wasn't loud. It wasn't violent. It didn't need to be. The denial was structured in a way that made it hard to challenge openly. The agent used procedure as a shield, the rules as a cover, but the pattern was clear to those who had lived it before. Stories like Kian's are part of a broader archive. Stories told quietly over dinners, remembered on long drives, shared between family members who know the rhythm too well. The act of traveling while Black is often accompanied by a quiet readiness to be questioned, to be delayed, to be told no. This readiness is not born from fear. It is shaped by experience. It is passed down not as a lesson in submission, but as preparation. Eunice's stories always ended with survival, with persistence. She navigated the waiting rooms. She made the trips. She taught Kian that movement itself was a form of resistance. His own life built on those lessons. The boarding gate, the security line, the hotel check-in. Each was a space where assumptions followed him. Each required a quiet strategy, a calculated patience. The restrictions no longer wore official signs, but their presence remained in the questions, the double checks, the tone of disbelief. These moments produce something more complex than simple frustration. They create racial trauma, an emotional injury that sits quietly but deeply within those who carry it. It changes how a person stands in line. It shapes how they prepare documents. It sharpens how they observe the faces scanning their credentials. It builds a form of vigilance that never fully softens, even in spaces where things go smoothly. The emotional labor of managing these moments often goes unseen. It demands calm where frustration is natural. It asks for patience where dignity is already under pressure. It expects silence in the face of public questioning. Kian's story is one among many, but his decision to act quietly without spectacle mirrors the choices made by countless others who push back against these patterns in their own ways. The refusal to be quietly removed, the decision to stand firm, the insistence that dignity is not conditional. These actions, when repeated across years and generations, have slowly pressed against the structures that allowed these patterns to remain unchecked. The story of Gate 14 fits into this long thread. It joins the stories of travelers who were denied service, who were questioned beyond reason, who were asked to step aside when their documents were in order. It also joins the stories of those who said no, of those who remained still, of those who called for accountability with precision, not volume. Kian's experience reminded his peers and the next generation that the right to move freely is not something granted. It is something inherent. The barriers may have changed shape, but the resistance continues. And with each quiet refusal to accept those barriers, the system shifts piece by piece. Not quickly, not completely, but with weight, with certainty. The echoes of those refusals remain, guiding the steps of those who follow. Kian never sought to control rooms with volume. His leadership didn't rely on speeches or forceful commands. His strength came from his ability to stand firm without demanding attention. His composure was not emptiness. It was a choice. He carried himself with intention, knowing that the world often expected him to break under the weight of quiet humiliations. His stillness was not surrender. It was strategy. It was power. Kian's refusal to argue at the gate, his decision to make a single call instead of raising his voice, was not a sign of retreat. It was a direct response to a lifetime of moments where raising his voice had too often been met with suspicion. This choice was not new. It belonged to a long tradition of black leaders, elders, and travelers who had learned to resist without spectacle. Kian's silence was filled with purpose. He knew what it meant to carry the burden of constant scrutiny. He knew how quickly calm could be misread as weakness, and how often anger could be weaponized against him. His leadership was shaped by patience and precision. He held his space, he took his steps, and he made decisions that rippled far beyond the moment. At the center of this was black joy, not as a fleeting emotion, but as a steady, deliberate act. For Kian, joy was not a performance. It wasn't loud, and it didn't require approval. His joy lived in his quiet victories, in the knowledge that his presence was not a request for permission. It was a declaration that he belonged. His joy came from continuing to move through spaces that had long been structured to exclude him. His joy came from standing still when others expected him to leave. His joy came from walking forward without bending his dignity to fit someone else's comfort. These moments of joy, deeply rooted, allowed him to remain whole in the face of systems that worked to chip away at his worth. Kian's story was not about revenge. It was not about proving a point to those who dismissed him. It was about choosing peace on his own terms, about defending his place with steady confidence. He left behind a lesson that stretched beyond the gate where the confrontation had unfolded. Leadership does not always look like confrontation. Sometimes it looks like standing quietly when every signal around you says you should shrink. Sometimes it looks like using the power you've earned without announcing it. Sometimes it looks like choosing joy, not because the world made space for it, but because you claimed it anyway. Kian's journey was a reflection of many who had come before him, those who carried themselves with quiet dignity, those who made their way through rooms that were not built to welcome them, those who refused to give up joy, even when it would have been easier to step aside. Black joy in this context was more than a celebration. It was survival. It was legacy. It was the ability to hold your head high, to build, to thrive, even when the road was lined with obstacles. It was a power to remember that even when the system asks you to prove yourself again and again, you don't need to be defined by that demand. Kian's story, though specific to one morning in an airport, spoke to something much larger. It spoke to the quiet choices made every day, to hold ground, to remain calm, to keep moving forward. These choices ripple. They shape the culture inside corporations. They influence how policies are written. They adjust how gate agents review tickets. The power of those choices lives in their ability to teach without spectacle. Leadership like Kian's doesn't always get noticed right away, but its weight lasts. His calm forced the system to pause. His phone call forced an institution to correct itself. His refusal to leave his place in line forced those around him to see him differently. And through all of it, his joy remained untouched. To those listening, to those watching, if you understand the weight of dignity, if you've ever had to hold your space when it was easier to walk away, this story is for you. If you faced silent barriers, if you stood in quiet lines and felt the weight of assumptions pressing against you, your story belongs here too. If you believe dignity must be defended, hit subscribe. This channel, Echoes of Black, holds space for stories like Kian's, like Dorian's, like the ones carried by travelers who move carefully through the world but refuse to surrender their joy. Your story matters. Your voice matters. Your experience adds to the archive of quiet leadership that changes rooms, changes policies, changes people. We invite you to share your story in the comments. Tell us about the moments when you stood firm. Tell us about the times you chose to carry your dignity instead of your anger. Tell us about the times you claimed joy as your own. Your story could be the next quiet shift that changes everything. Your voice could be the next step in the journey toward fairness. Together, these stories become more than personal experiences. They become a quiet, powerful movement that travels further than we can measure. Thank you for being part of this space. Thank you for believing that joy, dignity, and steady leadership still matter. We are listening. We are ready. And we will keep moving forward.